In rural Michigan, a search for a missing man ends in cold-blooded murder. Investigators call on a team of forensic scientists to establish the victim's time of death and bring his killer to justice. In Salinas, California, a couple finds a skeleton in a shallow grave under their house. A missing persons report, filed 14 years earlier, may have covered up a murder. Bones of lost victims may lie hidden for years. Time and the elements can destroy evidence. When those remains are finally discovered, the deceased have a chance to speak, and the tales they tell reveal grave secrets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The quiet agricultural town of Salinas, California, is known for its abundant produce. A town of hard-working people, it hardly seems the place for a murder. But on January 14th, 1998, the owners of a house discovered something that would change that impression forever. Jim Olson told his wife Sandra and her sister that he discovered something strange in the crawl space under the house while installing heating ducts.
I just happened to look over and there's like a pair of shoes.
He found a pair of tennis shoes sticking out of the dirt, with the toes pointing upwards.
I'm not joking.
I want to see it.
Sure.
That's creepy.
He was too large to reach them in the cramped space. To Jim, it looked as if someone may have been buried in a shallow grave.
I just got out of there. I didn't want to see.
I want to see what's that.
I'm not going back down there.
They all hoped it was a prank.
They're directly back there, right under the kitchen.
We can't just leave them down there. It's creepy.
Yeah, we can.
That is creepy. You know what? I'll go.
But Sandra volunteered to check, just to make sure.
I'll go. Flashlight again. Okay, be careful. Slide over here.
Yeah, straight back over the kitchen. See it?
Something was holding the shoes firmly in place.
It's stuck on something.
In the dim light, Sandra could see that the shoes were attached to a skeleton. Jim called 911. Officers from the Salinas Police Department responded to the call. Sergeant Miller and Detective McLaughlin were among the responding officers. Police confirmed that the bones were human, and the area was declared a crime scene.
Right, Dr. Galloway, as you can see, this is exactly how we found it. We got
To
the
properly
shoes up on
preserve the
stand.
site and recover the skeletal remains, investigators called in Dr. Allison Galloway, a forensic anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz campus. Remarkably, Galloway found the skeleton to be complete and undisturbed by animals. The initial examination determined that the bones were likely male and that they had been there for a number of years.
We could tell that the body had been there for quite a while. There was no odor, there was no grease in the bone, there was no soft tissue left. So we say usually that takes about 5 years, minimum, but it then can go anywhere up to 50 years. So we have quite a long range. We did see a lot of exfoliation of the bone. The bone itself wasn't disintegrating, but it was in a very protected environment.
Decomposed jeans and underwear suggested the victim had been fully clothed at the time of his death and burial. As Galloway carefully sifted through the remains, she found a .38 caliber bullet. Police now believed they had uncovered a homicide. As they scoured the area around the body, they uncovered some personal items, including a set of keys and a cigarette lighter. Sergeant Miller of the Salinas Police Department spoke with the family that currently owned the house.
A couple of real quick questions. Just pretty much the basics as far as when did you buy the house here?
They said that they had lived there for 2.5 years.
And I got the story just real quick. Let me just run it by and see if I got everything straight.
This was the first time anyone had been in the crawl space.
Push it over.
Now, investigators had to determine who this victim was. Without the victim's identity, police would not be able to track his
I
killer.
was surprised at how specific they are. I mean, this one's in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
The remains were sent to the UC Santa Cruz Anthropology Lab. There, they believed Dr. Galloway could provide vital information.
I'll get the bone board so we can do stature.
Okay. I'm going to go with the right femur.
Measurements confirmed that the remains were that of an adolescent male of European descent.
Okay,
He was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall.
To 5'10".
Okay.
Okay.
The bullet found among the remains indicated the victim had been shot.
The gladiolus and the xiphoid. On the sternal bodies.
To verify the cause of death, Dr. Galloway looked for any peculiarities on the bones.
Let's take a look at the skull here.
She discovered 2 gunshot holes in the victim's skull.
So, it looks like we have 2 entry wounds over here. This victim, we had a whole series of injuries. We had 2 gunshot injuries to the head, and at least 1 and possibly 2 gunshot injuries to the rest of the body. The first of the head ones came in on the right side, sort of around the ear, and probably exited through the left eye. And then the second injury came in a little bit further forward, and that moved and came out on this side over here.
There was also evidence of at least 1 entry wound to the victim's back.
And rib 7, we also have some breaking. Perimortem, this is around death.
Dr. Galloway reported her findings to Sergeant Miller.
Okay, doctor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
He cross-referenced the address where the victim was found with missing persons reports dating back from 5 years earlier. He came up with a promising match. A teenage boy named Chris DeNoyer was reported missing from the same residence in 1984. Sergeant Miller reviewed the report. There was a picture on file, and Dr. Galloway's assessment was consistent with the missing boy's description.
Chris DeNoyer was last seen January 13th, 1984, and it was his mother who had notified police that, in fact, her son was missing at that time.
Investigators obtained Chris's dental records. Dr. Kevin Landon performed the analysis. He compared the X-rays from Chris's file to slides of the victim's dental remains. He noticed something.
I found that there was a retainer, an orthodontic type retainer on the lower jaw extending from his left canine tooth to his right canine tooth with an orthodontic band around it. During the time that this individual was alive, that was a standard type of orthodontic retainer to place. Nowadays they are made a little different, bonded in the back of the teeth so that they're not so visible.
Dr. Landon had found a positive match.
I concluded that the dental remains from this individual under the house matched the dental records that I received.
Investigators finally had a name and a face for their victim. Now they needed to find out who had murdered Chris Denoyer. But after 14 years, the killer's trail was cold. Little evidence remained. Police were uncertain they would ever solve this case.
Yeah.
Police in Salinas, California struggled to track the killer of Chris Denoyer, whose body was found 14 years after he was reported missing. A .38 caliber bullet was the only evidence the killer left behind. Investigators now needed to reconstruct the events that led up to his death. First, they wanted to make sure there was no access to the crawl space from the outside of the house. They found none.
There's only one way in and one way out. So the two possible scenarios are either it's a stranger or it's somebody that lives in the residence. Now, if you try to play out the stranger scenario, you'd have to say the stranger came into the house, murdered Chris, and then hoped that they would have enough time to drag this body into their house, dig a grave, cover it over, and crawl out before anyone comes home.
And that didn't seem likely to the police.
In my mind, the people that were suspects in this case were anyone that had access and control to the residence in January of 1984.
And the only access was from inside.
I'm not sure.
But Sergeant Miller wanted to be certain that Chris hadn't been murdered after he went missing. He made another call to Dr. Kevin Landon.
One of the questions that Detective Andy Miller of the Salinas Police Department asked of me was that would it have been possible for Christopher to have actually run away, returned a few years later, possibly been murdered by someone and placed under the house? And I could tell him that that was impossible due to the fact that his wisdom teeth had not developed any further.
It was proof that Chris was murdered just before the missing persons report was filed.
Thank you very much.
The police report indicated that Chris had a girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. They hoped she could give some insight into the family.
So she was the first person that we decided to contact, primarily because since she didn't live in the house, she wasn't as likely in our eyes to be a suspect.
She was dismayed to hear the news of Chris's death. She stated she first met Chris Denoyer in 1983. They dated up until his disappearance in '84. Chris, she said, was her first love. When asked about Chris's relationship with his parents, she said that Chris and his stepfather, Jackson Viarta, constantly fought. Viarta was always on him about something. She said she never believed Chris ran away. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye to her.
Hi, Mrs. Viarta. Detective Miller from Salinas PD. We talked on the phone. Thank you.
Investigators decided it was time to speak with Chris's mother.
This is about your son, Christopher Denoyer.
Have you found him?
They tracked her down at her current residence.
And I'm so
She was shocked by the news that Chris's body had been found.
It's very important that we begin our investigation and try to find
On the day Chris disappeared, she was at work. Her husband, Jackson Villarta, called her and told her that Chris had run away. She had been convinced he was still alive. In fact, they had received a telegram from him a few days after he disappeared. Chris, she said, was an average teenager, but they had their problems with him. He and his sister were having trouble adjusting to life with her new husband, Jackson Villarta. Investigators asked if anyone in the family owned a gun. She said that Jackson Villarta had one for home security, but she didn't know the kind. Miller didn't believe that Chris's mother had anything to do with the murder.
At the time of this murder, Chris's mother was pregnant, and she's a heavy-set woman to begin with, so the idea of her going through this very small crawl space and digging, a 6-foot trench into her house and dragging a 180-pound victim under there, that's pretty much out of the question.
But they did have a suspect in mind. Chris's stepfather, Jackson Villarta.
Specific there, and you can see from the crime scene sketch here that this body. We felt that the only person that could possibly benefit from burying a body underneath a residence was the person who was in control of that residence, and in this case, that's Jackson Villarta.
Villarta worked for the telephone company. They found him on his route.
Excuse me, Mr. Villarta. How are you, sir?
As investigators approached, they noticed he had the right size and build to dig the 6-foot trench in the crawl space.
We're from Salinas PD.
Mr. Villarta, I already talked to your supervisor.
He agreed to accompany them in for questioning.
He came down.
He was cooperative and admitted that he and Chris had had their troubles. But he said that was normal. Teenagers often have conflicts with their step-parents.
One other thing I'd like to explain to you. A lot of times when people come down to the police department.
Villarta said he worked from noon to 8 p.m. on the day Chris disappeared. When he got home, his wife told him that Chris had run away.
This is Detective Miller.
His story contradicted what his wife had told investigators earlier.
Anything else?
A few days later, he said, they received a mailgram from Chris saying he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused and that he had moved out. Investigators were suspicious. Villarta admitted that he had 2 guns, a .22 caliber rifle and a .38 caliber revolver. The caliber of the handgun interested Sergeant Miller.
The rounds we'd found in the grave, that Chris had been murdered with a .38 caliber weapon. So it was a very significant piece of information.
The police needed to get a search warrant to examine the revolver. They went to Villarta's house to prevent him from entering and removing the handgun. With a warrant in hand, police searched the home where Villarta now lived. They collected the .38 caliber revolver and some ammunition.
I hear that his birthplace is LA. I don't know.
While they waited for the ballistics testing to be completed, they checked out Villarta's story. They secured all of his personal records for January of 1984.
So we've got to look at this. We've got a call.
There was one small detail that piqued their interest.
We've got a call at 1. Look at this. Hey, Bob. Yeah. Come here and take a look at this.
The mailgram that was supposedly sent by Chris 3 days after he disappeared was ordered from and billed to Villarta's home phone.
So this is dynamite. Right. But we've got to find
Chris had already been murdered.
Was calling these numbers.
Police knew that Villarta had written it.
So there was definitely somebody home. The one sentence in the mailgram that completely gave it away that Jackson was the author was when the statement was that in some ways Jackson was right. And you're talking about a 16-year-old kid who hated his stepfather. Is he going to write in this letter that he thinks that his stepfather was right? The only person that would write that was Jackson. So the whole idea of the mailgram right from the beginning was preposterous. 84.
The circumstantial evidence against Jackson Villarta was mounting.
The house on Navajo Drive.
But investigators would need one more piece of evidence to make an arrest. Detectives in Salinas, California had identified Jackson Villarta as the prime suspect in the murder of his teenage stepson, Chris DeNoyer. But they still needed physical evidence to link him to the scene of the crime. A .38 caliber revolver and ammunition were collected during a search of his house. Scott Armstrong, senior criminalist with the California State Department of Justice, examined the gun. He fired the weapon into a water tank. And collected the spent bullets.
The gun, whether it's a revolver or a pistol, will have two kinds of markings that they impress on the bullet: class characteristics and individual characteristics. The class characteristics would be things that would be common to all guns of that make and manufacture.
The individual characteristics are unique markings called lands and grooves, which are left on a bullet as it travels through the gun barrel. They are as individual as fingerprints. Using a comparison microscope, he compared the bullets from the crime scene to the bullets fired from Villarta's weapon side by side. The bullets matched.
There were class markings and individual markings that were sufficient that I could identify the bullet as having been fired from the revolver.
It was the hard evidence investigators needed.
Mr. Villarta, with your left hand, slowly reach out and open the door from the outside. Slowly step out of the vehicle and face away from me. Take 2 steps to your left. Stop. Put your hands behind your back and interlace your fingers. Get down on your knees.
On February 6, 1999, Jackson Villarta was arrested for the murder of Chris DeNoyer 15 years earlier. Under questioning, he denied all charges and maintained his innocence. At trial, investigators presented a videotape that proved it wasn't likely an outsider broke into the home, killed Chris, and then buried him in the crawl space. An officer matching Villarta's physical description dug a hole in the confined area. The experiment was timed. It took a little over an hour.
So getting back to the fact that if an outsider had come into this place, done the murder, and decided this was how he was going to dispose of the body, he would have had to commit himself to a minimum of 1 hour in sort of the danger zone, because if someone had come home while he was there, they would have been discovered.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Jackson Villarta and Chris argued that day.
You're going to give me that respect. Yes, you are.
Not my father.
You're going to give me that respect when you like it or not.
In a rage, Villarta grabbed his .38 caliber gun and shot Chris twice in the head and once in the chest. Then he hid his body in the crawl space under the house. On February 1st, 2000, Jackson Viarta was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 17 years to life. Jackson Viarta thought that burying his victim under the house would permanently conceal the evidence of his crime. But some killers believe time and the elements will erase the evidence for them. In June 1995, the Lansing Police Department in Michigan was working a difficult case. Detective Jay Trost led the investigation.
Got a missing person, has been missing quite some time. We're looking, I got a photo of here I'm going to pass out, see if anyone here can locate this guy or if everyone else.
29-year-old Mark Bosom had vanished.
Anyone got any questions on him or anything like that?
Do you know if he's supposed to be armed with any type of...
Well, we believe he's more of a victim. We don't suspect he'd be armed, but you never know, so be careful. At this point, I wouldn't really consider it.
Mark's wife, Cindy, reported him missing 3 weeks earlier.
For him, if you find anything about him, anyone that knows him, any information you might think is pertinent, just give me a call or leave me a message, and I'll get back with you. He's been missing for...
The longer Mark was missing, the more Detective Trost suspected foul play. He needed to find out if anyone had seen him or knew of his whereabouts. Officers were sent to interview his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They learned that the day before Mark disappeared, he cashed his income tax check and was paid from his job. But dozens of interviews turned up nothing else. The police could find no one who'd heard from him since his disappearance.
He wasn't seen anywhere, couldn't find anyone that had any kind of contact. We couldn't even find anyone that had even seen him or could remember seeing him, anything like that. So he just like vanished.
Sergeant Mark Murray was eager to speak with Mark Bosom's wife, Cindy, the last person known to have seen him. She admitted to him that she and her husband had their problems and were separated as a result, but claimed that both of them wanted to save the marriage.
She appeared to me to be a very loving and caring mother. She and Mark had a daughter, and she seemed to be trying to keep the family together. So they were trying to iron out their differences and get things worked out and patched up.
She told the sergeant that a few nights before his disappearance, Mark visited her at the bowling alley where she worked as a waitress. When he arrived, a man named Tom Hart was talking to her. Mark was uncomfortable with Hart and believed that he was interested in more than just a friendship with his wife. According to Cindy, Hart was infatuated with her. She told Sergeant Murray that on several occasions she noticed Hart following her after work. In fact, her husband insisted that she take out a restraining order against him. But Cindy considered Hart a friend and couldn't believe that he had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. Sergeant Murray wasn't so sure.
Hey guys, how's it going?
What I thought was that led a little more credibility to the fact that some foul play could have been involved in his gone missing as opposed to him just leaving on his own.
Investigators decided to take a closer look at Tom Hart. When questioned by investigators, Hart was cooperative. The 52-year-old claimed that he and Cindy Bosom had more than a friendly relationship. He said that Cindy was planning on divorcing her estranged husband and moving in with him, but was apprehensive about telling Mark. Hart admitted that the last time he saw Mark was the night before he disappeared. he had met with him in person to inform him of their intentions.
Well, then she should have been here.
While Mark wasn't happy about this news, the conversation ended cordially. In fact, he had asked Hart for a ride to a nearby convenience store. Hart agreed and dropped him off. As Mark walked toward the store, he approached two men who were standing outside. He seemed to know them. When Hart asked if he wanted a ride back, Mark declined, saying he'd get one later. That was the last time he saw him. Police asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Though he insisted he had nothing to hide, Hart refused, claiming he had no idea where Mark Bosom was. Investigators didn't believe him.
By his tone and his mannerisms and his basically, it's not that he wouldn't answer questions, but he was very evasive in his answers. He wasn't real forthcoming with a lot of information. We had to pry everything out of him. He would give you an answer to a question, but he never gave you any meat.
Investigators knew Hart was covering up for something. And there was still no evidence of a crime. Police in Lansing, Michigan worked to solve the missing persons case of 29-year-old Mark Bosom. Tom Hart, the last person to see him the night he disappeared, said he dropped Mark off at a convenience store. Investigators doubted his story. They contacted the manager of the convenience store to see if there was a surveillance camera in the parking lot. There wasn't one. And no one remembered seeing either man that night. With no evidence of a crime and only their suspicions that Tom Hart was involved in Mark's disappearance, investigators met to discuss their next move. The investigation was going nowhere. But then they caught a break.
At that point, there was some information that Tom Hart owned a farm. Well, from the time that Mark Bosom came up missing to like within a week and a half, Tom Hart decided to till up his land.
If Hart was involved in Mark Bosom's disappearance, it was also likely he would hide the evidence.
He could have taken him out to the farm and disposed of the body and tilled him up in the soil.
With the assistance of the Michigan State Police, Sergeant Murray conducted an air reconnaissance of Tom Hart's farm.
We were looking for where the ground had been tilled up and disturbed. Maybe a grave had been dug, that the furrows would be different in the ground.
It was a promising lead. But after hours of searching, there was no evidence of a burial or a recent grave. Without a search warrant, all investigators could do was wait.
After approximately a month, there was nothing. And on a missing case like this, it starts to go cold. There wasn't a whole lot more that could be done. What we needed to do is either find him alive or dead, and then go from there. We were unable to find anything.
The investigation had hit a dead end. Trost had been down this road before and knew that someday a clue would turn up. He just had to be patient. Almost a year and a half later, in nearby Shiawassee County, a man walking his dog made a terrible discovery. hidden among some brush, lay a human skull. He called the police. Detective Trost and crime scene technicians from the Lansing Police Department responded.
Hey, what we got going?
Investigators hoped this was the lead they had been waiting for. Until now, they had a suspect, but no hard evidence of a crime. They collected the decomposed skull, then carefully searched the area.
How long ago would you say you got here? How long has it been?
Nearby, they recovered articles of clothing, a blood-stained blanket, and more human remains. They also found a spent .22 caliber bullet casing. From the level of decomposition, vines that had grown through the tattered clothing, and some insect larvae, they determined that the body had been there for some time. But their search of the area yielded no clues to the victim's identity. Investigators forwarded the skeletal remains to Michigan State University for analysis. There, forensic anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer looked to the bones to help establish the person's identity.
Border of the eye orbit right along here.
After analyzing the shape and dimension of brow ridges on the skull, Dr. Sauer concluded that the victim was male, likely in his late 20s to early 30s. From the measurements of the femur, he determined the individual stood between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall. He also discovered marks on one of the vertebrae, evidence that this victim had been shot in the chest.
Our conclusion was that this was probably a homicide.
David, 314 to Central.
But detectives couldn't be certain that this victim was the long-missing Mark Bosom. The physical description roughly matched Bosom's, but it also matched countless other missing persons. To catch the killer and determine who the victim was, investigators would have to find a way to pinpoint exactly when this victim died.
Not too bad. Just getting some dental records. Oh, it is frustrating, very frustrating. At this point, there's no way for us to say for sure who this person is.
The victim's clothing and the blanket recovered from the crime scene were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Richard Merritt. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Merritt analyzes the life cycles of bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death.
The time of death can be determined using the life cycle of an insect. So basically when someone dies, the insects are attracted immediately to the body within hours.
Dr. Merritt began by identifying each of the species found on the shirt and blanket. Among the various insects present, Dr. Merritt observed an adult parasitic wasp. Though other insects are attracted to a corpse within 24 hours of death, research has shown that wasps will not appear and lay their eggs for several months. Then it takes time for the wasp larvae to hatch and mature into adults. Adding in the wasp's maturation process, Dr. Merritt narrowed down this victim's time of death.
The entomological findings showed that this body had been around from 4 to 8 months, maybe longer, since the person died.
Dr. Merritt's findings held promise. This victim hadn't been killed recently. Forensic botanist Dr. Frank Ewers analyzed the grapevines found growing through the victim's clothing. By examining the internal structure of the wood stems, Dr. Ewers was able to calculate the age of the vine.
Here you can see a growth ring. From this, we can tell that there was quite a lot of growth the previous year. So that meant that it had to be at least 15 months old. And so it told us that the body had to be there at least 15 months.
I haven't got any new information from anybody.
It was the break investigators were waiting for. Cindy Bosom put them in touch with Mark's dentist.
Statements here, what the people had said at the party store.
His dental records were sent to anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer. Dr. Sauer compared Mark's dental x-rays with the post-mortem x-rays taken from the victim's remains.
Once the police had an idea who the remains belonged to, they went to that person's dentist and were able to get a hold of dental records and dental x-rays. And that allowed us to do a side-by-side comparison and positively identify the remains as those of Mark Allen Bosom.
With the help of forensic examiners, police had finally identified the victim. Now they needed to tie Tom Hart to the crime. Looking for answers, they began questioning all known associates of the suspect.
And then let me know what happens.
Will do.
An acquaintance of Hart's told police that Hart owned a .22 caliber gun. In fact, he and Hart had used such a gun for target practice prior to Mark Bosom's disappearance.
You show me how it's done.
Okay, I will. Now, just watch the old timer. I'll show you how it's done. Okay, great. See you.
The information was enough to get a warrant to search Hart's property. Investigators paid particular attention to Tom Hart's gun collection. They recovered a Winchester Model 94 and a Remington 16-gauge shotgun. Detective Jay Trost knew that neither gun was of the caliber used in the homicide.
I was looking for a .22 handgun, something like that. I did collect some rifles. I didn't really, in my heart, believe that they were involved, but you got to collect everything, and sometimes stories change. So we took what we could find, but there wasn't much there.
18 months after Mark Bosom's murder, investigators had a suspect, but still no evidence against him. In Lansing, Michigan, police were investigating the murder of Mark Bosom. Their suspect, Thomas Hart, was obsessed with Mark's estranged wife. Police had a motive, but no evidence. A search of his property turned up nothing. Investigators learned that the vehicle Hart drove at the time of Mark Bosom's disappearance was parked outside his work. They impounded it for a closer inspection.
Tom, Detective Murray, you remember me? Here's a search warrant. We're taking your vehicle in for processing.
Although the car had been thoroughly cleaned, they detected trace amounts of blood.
When we went through it, we were able to determine with luminol that there was actually blood on the passenger seat.
And that wasn't all. When they cut the seat open, they discovered that the cushion below was covered with dried blood.
It had been there a year and a half, and it was degraded. I mean, it smelled like degraded blood. When you looked down, I went, whoa. I was expecting little trace amounts of blood. There was like a big puddle of dried blood. So with that was very, very good and exciting evidence for me, because now with this blood, we got somewhere to go. We can figure out whose blood it is. I am assuming at this time that it's probably Mark Bosom's blood. Now I got to figure out how to get that analyzed.
Investigators knew that if both parents were alive, a DNA match could be established.
I knew that the mother was alive. I called her, and she was able to tell me that the father was in fact alive. So we actually drew blood from both those people. It was turned over to the crime lab along with the evidence they had at the scene, and they were able to analyze that and hopefully get DNA.
They were in luck. It was a match.
The blood in the car matches both parents' blood, which in turn is Mark Bosom blood. So now we got an exact match. And in my mind right now, we got enough probably to get an arrest warrant for murder.
Police finally had the evidence they needed to arrest Tom Hart. But Hart was hiding out at his farm. Because of his violent history, they didn't want to rush the house. And it was only a matter of time before he came out. Police watched and waited.
He was pretty much aware that there was a warrant out for him by now, and he was hiding out. He actually walked out, got in the vehicle, and left, and he didn't even go out on the road. I'm guessing if he didn't go out on the road, maybe he thought the police weren't going to get him. But he drove through the field. When they saw that, they just swooped in on him.
Keep your hands where we can see them. Put your hands on top of your head. Turn and face the female officer. Now walk backwards towards me. Walk backwards towards me. That's it. Keep walking. Keep walking. Then get to the corner of the car and stop.
He was arrested for the first-degree murder of Mark Bosom.
Tom, we have a warrant for your arrest.
Hey, have a seat, please.
At the police department, Tom Hart was informed of his rights.
You understand you've been arrested for first-degree murder. Before we get into that, and I'll talk to you about that.
He refused to answer any questions and demanded his attorney.
We'll get you your attorney. We're ready. We can get someone to come in here. Ready, you can take him down to the jail. Right up there against the window.
He was placed in the Lansing County Jail to await trial.
Take him downtown.
When it became clear that Cindy Bosom only wanted to be friends, a jealous Hart confronted Mark Bosom. He lured him into his car. Then he drove Mark Bosom to a deserted area where he shot the unsuspecting victim in the neck. Hart disposed of the body, believing that no one would find it. On January 9th, 1998, Thomas Hart was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some killers believe they can get away with murder. Hiding a body may seem like the best plan, but even when many years have passed and only bones remain, forensic science can find the truth and uncover grave secrets. In suburban New York, a young mother is brutally murdered in her kitchen. Police race to identify her killer, but fragmentary clues left at the scene are all that remain. In Idaho, an elderly couple is found shot to death in their home. Eyewitness accounts vary. Police scour for clues and look to forensic science to identify a suspect. When killers are bent on revenge, nothing will stop them. But forensic examiners can find the hidden messages in the clues they leave behind and bring justice to those killed at close range. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The suburbs of New York City are more accustomed to a peaceful way of life, generally untouched by violent crime. In January of 1997, that would change.
Elementary Police 911 emergency. Can I help you?
Please, no.
Okay, all right, sir. All right. 1625 Pelham Drive.
Pelham Manor and Westchester County Police received an urgent 911 call.
1625 Pelham Drive.
Jim Martin reported that he found his wife Kathleen in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Police arrived and combed the scene. They learned that the 32-year-old woman had been shot in the face and stabbed. Because there were two weapons used during the homicide, Lieutenant Christopher Calabrese of the Westchester County Police Department speculated that there were two perpetrators.
Inspection of the body revealed that there was wounds to the abdomen, the hands, he had defensive cut wounds, and also a gunshot to the head. So we were looking for two suspects from the very beginning. Normally you're not going to have two different types of wounds on the same victim with one perp.
Anybody that might have made a offhanded comment.
Investigators interviewed Jim Martin. He was well known in the county. He and Kathleen owned a horse stable nearby. Jim told police the last time he saw his wife was earlier that day. The two had met for lunch around 1:30 in the afternoon. He went back to the stable, and she took care of some errands.
Anything at all, and every little detail.
Jim was cooperative and agreed to go to the police department later for questioning. The body was sent to the medical examiner for autopsy. Police discovered bloody footprints on the kitchen floor.
You've got a bloody footprint here.
They photographed and lifted the prints, hoping that once suspects were identified, they could match them to their shoes. To forensic examiners, the impression resembled a cowboy boot. On the outside of a pantry door, investigators found a bullet hole. It had been partially hidden by a Christmas card.
Lieutenant?
The bullet went through the cabinet door and landed on the shelf inside. The area was photographed and the bullet collected for further analysis. There was no sign of forced entry, and the burglar alarm had not been triggered. Lieutenant Al Mazziello of the Pelham Manor Police Department was disturbed by the violence of the crime.
Well, I was very surprised because Pelham Manor is the kind of place that we don't normally have a homicide. I was very concerned about the family.
At the police station, Lieutenant Calabrese started by narrowing down the suspects. Jim Martin was first on his list.
Jim was obviously the closest relationship to Kathleen Martin, who's her husband. He was the one who discovered the body. And in many cases, when there's a wife that is killed, we need to eliminate the husband as a suspect.
Martin consented to taking a voice stress exam.
Is your name Jim Martin?
The test is similar to a lie detector. It was not admissible in court. Police use it as a tool to eliminate potential suspects. Lieutenant Robert Giordano administered the exam.
Is that wall white? The science behind this particular instrument is that it measures a difference in your vocal response. There's a pattern that is printed that is in all our vocal cords, and as stress increases, there's a change in that pattern. So, did you murder Kathleen?
No.
Through a series of yes or no questions, Giordano determined that it was unlikely Jim Martin was involved in the homicide. He was cooperative and relayed information that might be helpful to the investigation. Kathleen's body arrived at the Westchester County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Lewis Rowe performed the autopsy. He x-rayed the body. He determined that a bullet entered the left eye, went through the skull, and exited the back of the victim's head. The bullet then went through the cabinet door and landed on the shelf. Gunpowder residue stippled her skin. Kathleen's killer wasn't more than a foot away when he pulled the trigger. As Rowe examined the body, he found a stab wound to the abdomen and what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands. From the size and shape of the gash, it appeared that it had come from a curved-shaped knife. He found a 9mm shell casing tangled in her sweater. It was another indication of just how close the shooter stood to his victim. The victim's clothing was sent to forensic expert Ted Schwartz. Since Kathleen's killers stood so close to her when she was murdered, he examined the sweater looking for any fibers or hairs that were transferred from killers to victim during the crime. The sweater was made of acrylic material.
The sweater, I realized pretty early on, was very sheddable. So I knew that if I was going to eventually look at suspect items, that the sweater fibers would be a good starting point of something to look for.
In order to recognize the fibers on a suspect's clothing, Schwartz needed to clearly identify them. He and his team used an alternate light source to separate the wavelengths of the colors in the sweater. They each wore different colored goggles, red, orange, and yellow. When the color of light matched the color in the sweater, the fibers would fluoresce, and only one of the examiners would see them.
635, nothing for me. 670.
Fibers from the victim's sweater appeared fluorescent when viewed through the orange goggles.
And I knew it was going to make the analysis a lot easier for me because of the fluorescence and the fact that I would be able to spot these type of fibers quite easily on things that I would eventually look at.
Investigators hoped that somewhere in Westchester County, invisible fibers were clinging to the killers. But who they were and how the police would find them was still a mystery. Detectives went to the stables that the Martins owned and operated. A worker told them that Kathleen was a popular riding instructor.
About 2 weeks ago,
But there were signs that someone may have wanted to harm her.
the horse trailer caught on fire out there. And weirdest thing was it had graffiti written.
A few months before the murder, a horse trailer was vandalized and set on fire. Kathleen's name was spray painted in graffiti on the side. The staff believed the vandalism was the act of an ex-employee named Carlos Cajigas.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
But there was no evidence linking him to the crime, and no charges were filed against him. Carlos Cajigas was brought in for questioning. Cajigas appeared cooperative. Kathleen, he said, was like a mother to him.
You need to know. I told you.
He would never harm her.
Test results are showing me that.
Besides, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was at a friend's house cleaning carpets.
Can't call him. There's no phone.
He described in great detail how they cleaned the rugs and then hung them out to dry.
The one thing that struck me initially was he was extremely cooperative, to the point where his cooperation became a question for us. And initially, when you talk to somebody or interview somebody, people fall into two categories: people who are going to relay information to you, and people that are trying to convince you of information. And he fell into the category of trying to convince me.
Is today Tuesday? Yes.
He agreed to take a voice stress exam, as Jim Martin had days earlier.
No.
Again, Lieutenant Giordano administered the test.
Do you know who murdered Kathleen?
No.
Giordano wasn't impressed.
I gave him the exam, and right off the bat, I knew he had failed.
The test was not admissible as evidence in court. Investigators believed they had a suspect, but they still had to connect him to the crime. Authorities in suburban New York had identified one of two suspects in the murder of Kathleen Martin. His name was Carlos Cajigas. He was recently fired from the horse stable Kathleen and her husband owned. He failed a voice stress test, but it was not admissible in court. Police had no real evidence. They needed more. Before they released him, he consented to a search of his car. Police collected several articles of clothing and vacuumed the interior for any loose hairs or fibers. Investigators questioned the friends and alibi of Cajigas.
The reason why we stopped by this evening, we want to talk to you about Carlos a little bit. What about it? Was a friend of yours?
The couple said he spent the afternoon with them cleaning rugs and did not leave until evening.
Well, as of late, she's been bugging me with spring cleaning, so we figured
Investigators reminded the two that they were still looking for another suspect in the homicide.
So it's just the three of you doing this carpet cleaning here.
Yeah, and he was here.
But the couple stuck by their story.
Appreciate your cooperation.
If we need to talk to you again, we'll be in touch.
Okay, sure. Feel free.
Sure.
Lieutenant Calabrese was suspicious.
Their version of what he had done, or what they had done in cleaning this rug, was completely different from what his version was.
Lieutenant Calabrese was certain he had identified one of the suspects. But there was no evidence against him.
He'll be explaining to you.
They ran a background check on Cajigas and found that he had a rap sheet for grand larceny and possession of stolen property.
$500, we're going to do execute a search warrant for Richard's farm.
And he had a frequent accomplice, a man named Michael Fernandez.
Okay.
Authorities did not have much to go on, but picked up Michael Fernandez for questioning.
We just want to ask you what you were doing on January 6th.
And Carlito's downstairs right now. He's told me
They told him they had Cajigas in custody and knew he was involved. The ex-con cracked.
don't take the whole rap.
Fernandez admitted that he and Cajigas had been planning to rob the Martins for weeks. He said he waited in the car while Cajigas went in the house. When Cajigas returned, he told him he shot and stabbed Kathleen because she went for the alarm. Cajigas handed him a 9mm gun and a knife to get rid of. Police didn't think Fernandez was telling the whole truth. It was rare that one person would use both a gun and a knife.
Is that what the gun is?
He had the gun. He gave it to him.
Still, he cooperated and took them to where he hid the gun and the knife. Police retrieved a curved knife. It was consistent with the weapon used to stab Kathleen. There were no identifiable prints or blood on it. Mike Fernandez was arrested. He was charged with criminal facilitation of a murder. Police also recovered the gun from the home of one of his friends. The ballistics examiner found no prints or blood residue on the weapon. The handgun was fired into a water tank, and a bullet was collected to compare with the bullet found in the pantry at the Martins' house. There were enough lands and grooves created on the bullet as it traveled through the gun barrel to make a consistent match. With the ballistic evidence and Fernandez's testimony, police had enough to arrest Carlos Cajigas. He denied any involvement in the crime. Police had the murder weapon, but there were no fingerprints tying it to Cajigas, and their key witness had a shady past. Police needed to crack Cajigas' alibi. Lieutenant Calabrese paid another call on the friends who said he was with them on the day of the murder. He pressed the woman for more details, reminding her that she could be held as an accessory to the crime if she lied to police.
You know that he's involved in this murder? You don't want to get involved in a murder investigation. That's not good for you, it's not good for your family. You can tell me the truth.
She retracted her story. Carlos, she said, was at her house on the day of the murder. But then he got a page and left to pick up a guy named Mikey.
All right, later.
That was around 2:40 p.m. She said he returned a few hours later, carrying a backpack.
You have it here now?
A few days later, she overheard Cajigas telling her boyfriend that he shot some woman. She still had the backpack and turned it over to police. DNA expert Mary Eustace examined a pair of gloves found among the items in the backpack. she discovered several dark stains that looked like blood. They tested positive for human blood. The sample was sent for DNA testing, but the results would take time. Police hoped that Ted Schwartz could shed some light on the evidence. All of the items, including the gloves and the vacuum sweepings from Cahigas's car, were sent to him for analysis. If the gloves had been in contact with Kathleen's sweater, fibers from the sweater likely transferred onto the gloves. Strands from the gloves were exposed to the alternate light source. He knew the specific wavelength of fluorescent light that would make the fibers of Kathleen's sweater glow. They lit up like a neon sign. Amid the vacuum sweepings from Cahigas's car, there too the debris glowed with the telltale fibers. 41 fibers found on the suspect's items were consistent with the victim's sweater. And that wasn't all. A double transfer had occurred. Fibers from Cahigas's gloves were found on Kathleen's clothing. The evidence proved that Cahigas had committed the murder. But investigators believed that Michael Fernandez was also involved in the crime, and they still had no proof. Police had arrested 2 men for the murder of Kathleen Martin. Carlos Cahigas denied all involvement in the crime. Michael Fernandez only admitted to waiting in the getaway car. When the local news reported that 2 men were arrested for the slaying, witnesses came forward. A neighbor of the Martins recalled seeing Carlos Cahigas running away from the house on the day of the murder. Her son saw Michael Fernandez.
We had 2 different subjects exiting the Martin residence. And in fact, later on, when Mike Fernandez's picture was on the news, and our witness identified him or said to his parents that that's the person I saw exiting the Martin residence.
Michael Fernandez was inside the house. Based on the evidence, police believe that Cahigas, bent on revenge, went to the Martin house to rob and kill Kathleen. Cahigas was the trigger man. His accomplice, Michael Fernandez, stabbed her.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that when he went to the Martin house, that his intention was to kill Kathleen Martin. And Kathleen Martin knew him. He went there without any type of a mask or disguise. And she could identify him, obviously, so his intention was to leave no witnesses.
On February 3rd, 1999, Michael Fernandez pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In November 1998, Carlos Cahigas was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. In New York, carefully collected forensic evidence helped bring swift justice and put 2 killers behind bars. Unfortunately, sometimes analysis and interpretation of the evidence is more difficult, and a killer may go free for years. Bonneville County is located in eastern Idaho in the upper Snake River Valley. There, residents enjoy clean air and wide open space. In early March 1992, Leo Downard, a retired plant worker, and his wife Mary went about their daily lives. The Downard children had married and left home, but they still lived close enough to drop by. Leo and Mary loved nothing more than spending time with their grandchildren. It was a time in their lives when they learned to appreciate every day. On March 24th, neighbors of Leo and Mary were concerned when they found several days' worth of newspapers on the couple's lawn. and the front door slightly ajar. Inside,
Leo!
they learned the gruesome truth. Leo Downard lay motionless on the living room floor. The neighbor also noticed some blood. He called 911.
Public safety, Melissa.
Investigators from the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. Sergeant Kim Marshall and Detective Victor Rodriguez were among the officers. Leo Downard was dead on the floor in the living room. He was in his pajamas. It appeared he had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to his head and chest.
There's some cases over there.
Police scoured the room for clues. A trail of blood spatter extended around the body. 3 shell casings were scattered across the floor. The casings were photographed and collected. Upstairs, Mary Downard's lifeless body lay on the bed. It appeared she too had been shot multiple times. There were no signs of forced entry. The intruder had not left any fingerprints. Sergeant Marshall had a theory.
When we arrived at the residence, we found Mr. Downard was downstairs. He was next to a couch. Up the stairs and in the master bedroom, we located Mrs. Downard. The conclusion I had at the time was they'd opened the door to somebody they knew because they were shot during the night. It was obvious they were in bed, and they had a routine that they went through, locking the residence up when they went to bed, and somebody had to get them to open the door for them.
Detective Victor Rodriguez looked for any clues.
I turned the flashlight on and put it on the ground, and I showed the beam of light across the floor.
Next to the door, he found a tennis shoe print in the dust.
We didn't know whose it was. We thought maybe it might have been one of the paramedics. So immediately before the paramedics left, we looked at their shoes and found it's not the same shoe print. That was our suspect.
You need to take a picture of that.
The prints were photographed for a more detailed examination.
Here's one.
Rodriguez collected 3 shell casings from the bed.
Another casing. About the same caliber.
Outside, investigators found an almost perfect print in the mud. It appeared to be the same type of print found in the bedroom. They made a plaster cast of the impression. Once they had a suspect in custody, they hoped to match his shoes to the scene. The medical examiner performed the autopsies. He confirmed that Leo and Mary Downard were each shot 3 times. Several bullet fragments were collected from Leo's skull and upper chest. Mary had also been shot in the head. The last shot surprised the medical examiner. The bullet had entered through the back of her head, just behind her left ear, at point-blank range. Sergeant Marshall questioned the Downard's children to see if they might know of someone who held a grudge against their parents. Their son said he couldn't think of anyone who would do this.
They're real good Mormons.
The two were beloved in the community and were devout churchgoers.
Was there any neighbors that they were having?
To Sergeant Marshall, they were brutal, senseless slayings. The ballistic evidence was sent to the Oregon State Police Forensic Lab in Ontario, Oregon. Lieutenant Rocky Mink examined the evidence.
In the Downard case, we were actually comparing fired bullets from the deceased to fired cartridge cases recovered at the scene.
He determined that the bullets and casings had come from a .22 caliber firearm. The shell casings were consistent with a .22 caliber rifle. He reported his findings to the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office. A rifle suggested that the killer may be a hunter who had the gun in his collection. It would have been hard to conceal. Police wondered if the perpetrator was concerned about hiding it at all. Idaho police struggled to find the gunman who shot down Leo and Mary Downard in their home. Shoe impressions left at the scene and .22 caliber bullets and casings were all that pointed to a killer. Investigators canvassed the Downard neighborhood looking for answers.
Hello, sir. Detective Rodriguez from the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office. Can I speak with you a moment? Come on, sit here.
One neighbor had seen a man at the house on the day of the murders. His name was Robert Buchanan, a local lawn care worker who had his own business. Buchanan did lawn work for many in the area, including the Downards. Sergeant Kim Marshall ran a background check on Buchanan to see if he had a record. The report indicated that Buchanan had threatened his ex-wife with a .22 caliber weapon, the same caliber firearm used in the Downard murders. He quickly became Sergeant Kim Marshall's prime suspect.
We looked at him as a suspect at the beginning of this homicide due to what we learned from our neighborhood interviews and doing some background checks. We found that there was some violence in his history.
Armed with a warrant, investigators searched Buchanan's apartment. They collected several articles of clothing, including a pair of white tennis shoes. But there were no guns of any kind. The shoes were sent to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab. There, senior criminalist Donna Shepherdson Mead compared the photographs of the shoe prints found in the bedroom to Buchanan's tennis shoes. But making an accurate comparison to the pictures was difficult.
The photograph was color. It was slightly out of focus. The camera was canted at a slight angle to the impression. And also, there was no scale included in this picture. Normally, we would use the scale to make a one-to-one enlargement.
Shepherdson Mead was able to determine that the print in the bedroom had the same brand design as Buchanan's tennis shoes, but Buchanan's shoes seemed to be too big. She hoped the cast taken outside the crime scene would make for a better comparison. A print was lifted from the shoe using dusting powder and transparent paper. Shepherdson Mead overlaid the print on the cast taken outside the residence. Again, the design matched, but the shoes seemed to be larger than the ones at the scene. It wasn't what investigators hoped, but they still believed Robert Buchanan was their killer. Police widened their search. Witness testimony had revealed that Buchanan's father had a gun collection. And Buchanan was a frequent visitor at the house.
You do have a 22 over here.
His father owned several rifles, including a .22.
Why don't you come on over and help the box?
Permission was granted to take the firearm. The gun was sent to Lieutenant Rocky Mink at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. To determine if the bullet casings recovered from the crime scene and the bullet fragments collected at autopsy had come from this rifle, Mink had to fire off a few rounds. He then collected the fired bullets and their casings. He examined the bullets through a comparison microscope.
The test fires from the known Remington rifle were examined and compared to the bullets removed from the deceased. Based on the microscopic detail that was present in the land and groove impressions, I was able to draw a conclusion that these bullets were fired from the suspect Remington rifle.
Investigators had proof that the .22 caliber rifle had fired the deadly shots. Robert Buchanan was charged with both murders. But a judge was not impressed with the police findings. The gun had not been found in Buchanan's possession, and the match of his sneakers to footprints found at the scene was inconclusive. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Life in the town of Ammon went on uneasily, and the police could not let the crimes go unpunished. They had the murder weapon, but no evidence to tie anyone to the crime. 15 months later, Bonneville County authorities reopened the investigation.
Okay, Kim and Bud, why don't you go back to the house and start on the crime scene again.
Detective Victor Rodriguez was assigned to the case.
You'll see that there's statements from witnesses that put him in that area, and some of them said that this is the shoe prints that we saw.
Investigators pored over the evidence, looking for one small clue they must have overlooked. Rodriguez knew it wouldn't be easy.
It's one of the most difficult cases I handled because you had to start from the very beginning. You had to go back to the very beginning of this homicide and omit everything else that was learned and proceed with who could have been the suspect at that time.
Investigators re-interviewed the Downards' neighbors and friends. A neighbor did recall seeing a man drive by the house several times that day. It was Lanny Buchanan, Robert Buchanan's younger brother.
That's the last I saw him.
Lanny lived in the neighborhood, and he saw him often. Detective Rodriguez realized that Lanny had access to the .22 caliber rifle.
Okay, thank you.
The investigation took a major turn.
The more that I followed this case, the more that I investigated this case. When I focused on Lanny, halfway through the investigation, everything opened up like a puzzle, and Lanny put the pieces in that puzzle.
And the more they learned about him, the more suspicious they became. Many people described him as a slow learner with a violent temper. There was more. When word got out that Lanny was now a suspect in the murders, police received some unusual information.
All the women that we spoke to, all the friends that we talked to, all the men that we talked to, all said that Lanny would visit older ladies continually. Now, to me, that was a red flag.
One woman said that shortly before the murders, Lanny came over to her house upset and agitated. When she asked him what was wrong, he said that he had given Mary Downard a hug and that Mary had told him not to come over anymore. Lanny was very upset. Detective Rodriguez brought Lanny in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murders and didn't recall the incident with Mary. The Downards were great people, and he frequently stopped by their house to say hello. When asked if he used his father's gun, he said he did, to go hunting on occasion. On the night of the murders, Lanny said he was at a friend's house watching a basketball game. He was released.
Did you tell me if did you kill the Downards?
Rodriguez contacted Lanny's friend to confirm his alibi. Lanny was there that night, but he left abruptly, saying he was going hunting. Police obtained a search warrant to search Lanny's house. In his bedroom closet, they discovered a pair of tennis shoes identical to his brother Robert's. They sent Lanny's shoes to forensic expert Donna Shepherdson-Mead. She compared them with the cast taken outside the Downard residence. The tread, the general wear pattern at the ball of the foot, and the heel were consistent with Lanny's shoe. And these were one size smaller than the pair worn by Robert Buchanan, a direct match with the plaster cast taken at the crime scene.
I eliminated the larger pair of shoes, the size 9.5. I could not eliminate the size 8.5 pair of shoes.
The plaster shoe print placed Lanny Buchanan outside the Downard home. But he admitted he stopped by their house often. Investigators would need evidence that he was actually inside the house to make an arrest. Idaho police had a new suspect in the brutal murders of Leo and Mary Downard. Lanny Buchanan's shoes matched impressions found outside the residence. But they had to place him inside the house to be certain they had the right suspect. Investigators weren't going to take any chances with the photographs taken inside the house. They sent the crime scene photos to L. Eric Greenwade, a leading mathematician at the Idaho National Engineering Lab. First, Greenwade scanned the images into his computer. He corrected the pictures taken in the bedroom so he could accurately compare them to Lanny and Robert's shoes.
There were several problems with the photographs that were originally received. The first of which were the angle from which the photographs were taken, which was not directly above the footprint. Secondly, there was no objects directly related to measurement within the photographs, so that accurate measurements were difficult to take.
He needed to see the print head-on. Next, he used a special software program that created a mathematical reference and measured the grain in the wood floor.
The wood grain provided several points that we could measure very accurately. Those measurement points were then very carefully computed to form a background grid. Those background grids were then compared against the scanned photographs and provide the reference points for which the image could be corrected.
A computer then converted measurements into mathematical equations that corrected the problems created by the poorly taken photograph. Using the corrected images, Greenwade easily identified features such as nicks in the soles of the shoes. Lanny's shoes matched.
The measurements that were obtained from the image matched one of the pairs of shoes. This established a very strong connection to one set and yet not the other. In addition, there were several imperfections noted in the dust impression left on the floor that matched imperfections that were in the same pair of shoes.
Over a year and a half after the Downard murders, Lanny Buchanan was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Based on the evidence, police believe that Lanny Buchanan went to kill the Downards because Mary had rebuffed him. He forced his way in, carrying a .22 caliber rifle. Leo had nowhere to run. Mary was upstairs, stirred awake by the gunshots. But she never got the chance to get out of bed. In November 1996, Lanny Buchanan was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. When killers are desperate for revenge, it takes the hard work and determination of forensic professionals to provide the scientific facts that prove innocence or guilt, and ultimately provide justice to those who are victims of violent crime. In Tampa, Florida, women become a sadistic killer's prey, and cemeteries his personal dumping ground. As the body count rises, detectives confront a serial killer using science as their only weapon. In North Carolina, a young mother disappears on her way home from work. When her body is discovered, detectives must expose the hidden tracks of a killer if they are to find justice for her family. In most homicides, police rely on motive to pursue a murderer. But when the killer is a stranger, the crime may go unsolved for years. It takes a full arsenal of forensic techniques to trace a lethal encounter. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Tampa, Florida, October 10th, 1986. Detective Robert Parrish received a disturbing call. A jogger had discovered the nude body of a young black woman at Centro Español Cemetery. Crime scene investigators were dispatched to the scene. As they set up a perimeter, Detective Parrish questioned the jogger. Ron Denny said he ran through the cemetery daily. He rarely saw anyone. But this morning was different. The detective examined the body for injuries.
We had a nude black female in an open cemetery lot here. We found no signs of any cutting or stabbing, anything, no open wounds like that. She did have a fine mist of blood on her right side. It appeared to come out of her nasal area. This indicating that she had died either by blunt trauma or by asphyxiation.
Based on the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered less than 12 hours earlier.
Over here, so it looks like she was thrown out of a truck.
More than enough time for the killer to flee. Detective Parrish knew it would be a difficult case. They had to conduct a thorough search of the crime scene. As they photographed the victim, they noted she was barefoot. Oddly, the bottoms of her feet were clean. The ground was moist. She couldn't have walked to this location, and investigators saw no evidence she was dragged. The victim's personal effects were scattered all over the area. Each piece was numbered and cataloged as potential evidence.
We found her panties and top and her wig scattered throughout when we did a crime scene search.
The forensics team recovered a pair of women's shoes. There were also beer bottles and a cigarette pack. But there was no wallet or driver's license to identify the victim. Not far from the body, investigators found fresh tire tracks. Detective Parrish surmised the victim had been killed elsewhere and dumped in the cemetery.
The major item that we found was 9 feet from her head in the soft dirt there was a tire impression, obviously made by a big tire. Additionally, off 46th Street here, we had tire tracks coming in and what appeared tire tracks leaving.
A large vehicle, a truck or an SUV, made the tracks. Technicians made casts of the tread prints using plaster. Based on the condition of the body, investigators were confident a vehicle had been involved in the crime. The plaster would set in minutes, but it would take days to determine whether the tracks were significant. After processing the crime scene, officers canvassed the neighborhood, hoping that someone might have seen or heard something the night before.
When was the last time you talked to him?
I'm not sure.
Nobody had.
Okay,
At autopsy, the medical examiner noted pitula, a pinpoint hemorrhage in the victim's eyes. This, as well as linear abrasions on the collarbone and throat area, indicated that the victim had died from asphyxiation. Several bones in her neck were also broken. The medical examiner determined that a large individual had used his hands to manually strangle the victim. Ligature marks on her wrists revealed she had been bound before she was killed. Based on the degree of rigor mortis and the amount of insect activity, the medical examiner concluded that she'd been killed less than 12 hours earlier. Strands of the victim's hair were collected. In the event a suspect emerged, it was possible a strand of her hair was still in the suspect's vehicle. Identifying the victim was their next priority. Fingerprints were taken and run through the Tampa police database. Within hours, Detective Parrish had a match. The victim was 34-year-old Tamara Jones.
After I found her identity, I located her mom and broke the news to her mom, and then got as much information. You get as much background information you can about her habits, who she was seeing, any steady boyfriends. About what you'd seen on that night.
From Tamara's mother, Detective Parrish learned a lot about the victim. She had been an outgoing girl, full of promise, until the lure of crack cocaine reduced her to a life of painful addiction. To pay for her habit, Tamara became a prostitute.
There was about 4 different bars in what we call the West Tampa area that she frequented. And in my job as an investigator, I had to go to the bars, find out who she knew, who she was seeing with, and just do some good legwork. You know, I found out that everybody spoke fairly highly of her. All the people I interviewed said that she was a very good girl, and she was a very good individual. Yeah, I talked to your mother
But Tamara's life on the streets put her in contact with a lot of unsavory characters. No one that the police talked to was able to pinpoint a suspect in Tamara's murder. Detective Parrish hit a dead end. He now looked for clues in other unsolved homicide cases. Not only from Tampa, but in Hillsborough County and surrounding cities. It took a week to review 2 years' worth of homicide files, looking for similarities. In the end, Detective Parrish was stunned by what he found.
Detectives had been working on several of the reports of previous homicides and similar type victims. We had other black females. They were known prostitutes. They were found in cemeteries. They were nude. They were all strangled. They had literature marks around their wrist, which means they had been either tied up or a restraining type device used on their wrist.
Detectives from the Tampa Police Department and Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office pooled their resources. Along with other agencies in the area, they formed a task force to find and stop a killer. But the lack of physical evidence found at each of the crime scenes and the lifestyle of the victims made them difficult cases to solve. Detective Parrish was certain they were dealing with a serial killer.
As soon as I get at the information, I'll start looking at
Somewhere in the Tampa area, he was waiting to strike again.
Get back with me with the information.
And police hadn't a single clue to his identity. Authorities in Tampa, Florida were certain they were dealing with a serial killer. 2 recent homicides bore striking similarities to a string of murders that went back over 2 years. Detective Robert Parrish knew they needed a suspect. But none of the investigators working the case had even a clue.
All the other detectives were obviously involved in the other cases who were at different stages, but you know, nobody really had anything concrete that we could say 100% sure. Several of the other detectives had different leads that they were investigating. And Garden of Memories.
News reports about the latest victim caught the attention of a potential witness. A man named Adam Childs contacted police. He told them that he knew Tamara Jones from the Tampa bar scene. He had seen her the night before her body was found in the cemetery. A dark truck approached Tamara on the street. She talked to the man inside. Childs had seen the vehicle in the neighborhood, but he didn't know to whom it belonged. For investigators, the dark truck rang a bell. They searched their files once again. 8 months earlier, a prostitute claimed that a customer in a dark truck had tried to kill her. The woman was afraid to press charges, but she agreed to speak with police about the incident.
Then, what happened inside the truck?
As she told investigators, a large black man she knew as Big Mike tried to pick her up that evening.
They were talking about, selling on a price for sex, and then he grabbed her around the throat and started to choke her. She reached for the doorknob, and then she got out, ran, and screaming through the neighborhood. The police were called, and he had fled the scene.
She gave investigators descriptions of Big Mike and the truck he was driving.
We can put him behind bars.
But she again refused to press charges or to testify against him.
Can you use both his hands or one hand?
Investigators checked their files. Big Mike was the nickname of a Tampa man named Michael Tyrone Crump. Police went to Crump's residence. The suspect was not at home, but a dark truck matching the witness's description was parked in the driveway. The officer photographed the vehicle. Detective Parrish then asked Adam Childs to come back to the station.
I did what's called a photo pack. I took, 6 different pictures of different trucks, including this individual we now become to label as a suspect. And the witness immediately picked out the truck.
Tampa police believed that Michael Tyrone Crump had committed at least 2 crimes, but they didn't have sufficient evidence to arrest him. Based on their 2 witnesses, they did have probable cause that these crimes were committed in his truck. And police have the authority to seize a vehicle if they believe it was used for illegal activities and may contain evidence of those crimes. Detective Parrish wanted to seize Crump's vehicle in a public place when it was on a public roadway.
We stopped the truck on the city street and informed the driver, who turned out to be Michael Tyrone Crump, that we needed his truck for evidence. It was used in a recent crime.
You can contact me at. When we finish processing your truck, I'll give you a call.
Crump remained calm, even when they asked if he knew Tamara Jones.
Good luck.
He said no. They informed him that he was not under arrest and that he was free to go. His truck was taken to the Pinellas County Sheriff's impound lot, where it was examined by trace evidence specialist Timothy Whitfield.
As a part of searching the vehicle, we were charged with finding any and all evidence that might be in there, from the things that are visible to the things that might be invisible to the naked eye.
Investigators first processed the vehicle for visible evidence. They found a woman's earring on the floor of the cab.
Go ahead and put that in a bag.
They also found a wooden device with a piece of rope attached called a garrote. Whitfield had no doubt as to its purpose.
It could be used to wrap the hands or feet of victims, and of course that's something that is unusual. Not everybody has that in their vehicle, and you would ask the question, well, why do you need this? What are you using it for if you're not using it as a restraint device?
Hidden between the rubber matting and the tire wall, investigators found another clue. It was a driver's license belonging to Janet King, one of the young women killed prior to Tamara Jones. Her body had also been found in a cemetery. Since King was a prostitute and Crump was a known John, the item in itself could be explained away. But to Whitfield, the location of the license was incriminating.
Either it was intentionally placed there by the suspect to hide it, or perhaps the victim put it there in hopes that in days to come someone would find something of her in that vehicle.
Now the team focused on evidence invisible to the human eye. They used a chemical called luminol to test for the presence of blood. A phosphorescent glow revealed a fine spray. The pattern was familiar. It matched the blood spatter from Tamara Jones's nose and face. Unfortunately, the droplets were tiny, no larger than pinpoints. There was no way to prove they belonged to the victim.
There was nothing that I was able to do because of the microscopic nature of the blood. That, of course, was prior to the days of DNA, and you needed quite a bit more blood to do complete workups.
Investigators vacuumed the interior of the truck, searching for any hair or fibers that could link the victims to the suspect. One intriguing find was a long knife hidden behind the front seat of the truck.
Got a pretty good sized machete, looks like. That's pretty good size, but good surface though.
I'll go ahead and secure this.
All right, careful.
In the laboratory, forensic examiners determined that the rope on the garrote was the same diameter as the ligature marks found on the wrists of the victims. Perhaps one of the most important pieces of evidence was a long strand of hair, one that couldn't have come from the suspect. Analysis of the root showed that it had not just fallen out. It had been ripped out of the scalp. The hair strand was compared to samples taken from Tamara Jones. The color and texture didn't match. When it was compared with Janet King's hair, however, it matched. Both were colored with identical hair dye. Technicians were confident that they had come from the same person. While the evidence from inside the truck was compelling, all it proved was that Janet King had been inside the vehicle. Now, detectives needed to tie Michael Tyrone Crump's vehicle to the murders. Time was running out. Without solid evidence, Crump would remain free, and more women could wind up dead. Authorities in Tampa, Florida were certain they were dealing with a serial killer. 2 recent homicides bore striking similarities to a string of murders that went back more than 2 years. Detective Robert Parrish needed to connect Tamara Jones' murder to suspect Michael Crump's truck. Tire tracks left at the scene were his best hope. He sent the tire casts made at the crime scene, along with the vehicle's tires, to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. There, analyst Oral Woods studied the treads to see if Crump's truck had made the impressions found near Tamara Jones's body. Woods was surprised that Crump's truck had 3 different types of tires. The 2 front tires had similar treads. The rear tires had different tread designs. 2 of the tread designs on Crump's tires matched the tread designs in the casts made at the crime scene.
And I told Detective Parrish that we're definitely in the ballpark. We definitely could do something with them, that there was class characteristics present in the cast as well as some individual characteristics.
Class characteristics like tire size and tread design can indicate a specific manufacturer. By carefully comparing photographs, Woods determined that the tire tracks at the crime scene had identical class characteristics to Crump's rear tires. He then analyzed the casts and the tires for individual characteristics. Things like nicks, treadwear, or embedded pieces of gravel that can make a tire track as unique as a fingerprint. On the right rear tire, he found what he was looking for.
I found one area on the tire that has some cuts and nicks, which I was also able to find on the plaster cast that was poured at the crime scene. I went one step further. I made a plaster cast of that area and recorded the same individual characteristics.
Woods confirmed that the tire track found at the crime scene was made by the suspect's right rear tire. On February 7th, Michael Crump went to the Tampa Police Department to ask about getting his truck back. But first, Detective Parrish had some important questions for him. Like how a woman he'd been seen with on October 9th was found dead the next day, and why his tire tracks were found several feet from her body. Crump again denied knowing Tamara Jones. He claimed that he'd been working in the area and cut through the cemetery the night before the murder.
Let me show you something, what was found in your truck. You see that? That's her license. And that was found
But when the detective brought out one more piece of evidence, Janet King's driver's license, Crump was surprised and sensed that he had been caught.
He's a big guy, and he slumped his shoulders down and looked down, which indicated to me that I had, with the license, showing him the license, that I had struck a nerve.
Crump admitted to picking up Tamara Jones on the night in question. He claimed they fought and that Tamara had tried to stab him. He admitted to strangling her, but swore it was in self-defense. To the detective, Crump's version of her death could not explain the restraint device and ligature marks left on the victim. The evidence pointed to a well-planned MO that Crump had used before. Detectives next questioned Crump about the murder of Janet King. He admitted to once having picked her up, but claimed she left him within minutes. He said he knew nothing about the other 7 victims. They didn't buy his explanations.
All indications are that because of the other black females turned up a similar type of death, that he was involved in those. We were able to tie him 100% to 2 of the homicides that were similar, but not enough evidence to tie him to the others.
In separate trials, Crump was found guilty of the murders of both Tamara Jones and Janet King. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The other murder cases remain officially unsolved. Michael Tyrone Crump attacked women he randomly selected from the streets. But in North Carolina, an innocent encounter with a stranger ends in violence and death. On August 8, 1990, a Raleigh, North Carolina police officer responded to a report about a suspicious minivan parked on a side street. The officer called in the tag numbers.
Tags Mary Young John 1971.
The vehicle was registered to 24-year-old Katie Valoria, an employee at a nearby hospital. The previous evening, Katie's husband had reported her missing. The officer made a gruesome discovery. Inside the van was the new dead body of a young woman. As police cordoned off the area, crime scene investigators arrived on the scene. Detective John Beasley examined the van.
Indications were looking through the windows. There was a struggle inside the van based on the fact that her shoes were located in the front part of the van. Her body is in the back of the van. Pantyhose were around her neck. They had been pulled tight. They weren't knotted or anything, but they were still tight around her neck. It was obvious she had been strangled.
The victim's clothing and purse were missing. There was also evidence suggesting sexual assault. Investigators scoured the exterior of the van for clues. A canine team was called in to assist. The handler gave the dog the scent and commanded him to track. The dog led the handler down the street and away from the van. Crime scene investigator W.E. Hensley was part of the search team.
Basically, it told us that whoever parked that van there, this early in the morning, got out of the van on the driver's side, went up to the street to the employee parking gate of the hospital, went by that gate and went to an area where there was a parking space. And that was significant.
It appeared the attack had started here. Police searched the area, but found no additional clues. The van was taken to the Raleigh Police impound lot, where the body was removed for autopsy.
I felt that in moving the van, we would remove the entire crime scene with the body in it and move it to a location where it could be processed properly.
Hensley didn't want to lose any critical hair or fiber evidence by opening the van under less than ideal conditions.
Every crime scene tells a story. The time of day, the ambient conditions, who was the victim, what kind of signature might have been left by the suspect. As far as processing the vehicle, we felt that trace evidence, which is hairs, fibers, things of that nature, were going to be very important to the case. Of course, you never rule out the possibility of fingerprints or any other kind of impressions that you might get.
They dusted for prints, but only found a few useless smudges. The killer, it appeared, had tried to wipe his prints before abandoning the vehicle.
Whoever went into that vehicle left some of their self there and then took some of that vehicle with them. And so we were looking for any traces of those two criteria.
In the front seat, they found a pair of women's shoes. They were scraped on both the heel and toe. A set of jumper cables was also found in the front seat.
The jumper cables indicated that possibly the victim was in the process of helping someone with a vehicle problem, probably in the parking lot.
On the driver's floor mat, investigators spotted muddy footprints.
There was an impression on these mats. It appeared to be that of a tennis shoe. We felt possibly that may be of value to us.
But the mats had to be handled with extreme care.
What we had to be concerned with is that the mats are flexible. In flexing the mats or moving them about much, you were going to actually distort the impression left in mud. So we had to keep them perfectly flat, place them in boxes and tape them over so that we could transport these without disturbing the impressions.
Technicians searched for trace evidence. Any hair or fiber adhering to the tape lift would be preserved and examined. They found some hairs embedded in the ceiling of the van. They were inconsistent with the victim's hair, which meant they could belong to her killer. Detectives theorized that the killer had climbed on top of the victim and rubbed his head against the ceiling of the van. Investigator Hensley began to piece together a profile of the killer.
From all indications, he was in the employee parking lot and therefore may be associated with the victim to some extent in that they worked at the same place.
At autopsy, the medical examiner observed contusions on the victim's neck and determined she had been strangled to death. Strands of hair were removed and placed in an envelope. The hairs went to the crime lab, where analysts could compare them to other strands found during the investigation. There was also evidence of sexual assault. The examiner collected samples of biological fluids found on the victim. A brutal rapist and violent killer was loose on the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina. Detectives had to find him before he could strike again. In North Carolina, police investigated the violent rape and murder of a 24-year-old wife and mother. With little information and no witnesses, detectives went to the hospital where Katie Valoria worked. According to her colleagues, Katie was well-liked and had no enemies. On the night of her death, she left work just before 6 p.m. The co-worker described Katie as a devoted wife and mother. She got along well with everyone in the workplace. Katie's colleagues said she couldn't imagine Katie having a single enemy in the world. A colleague who left moments later didn't see her or any strange individuals in the parking lot. Without any witnesses, investigators would have to try a new approach. Since Katie's purse was not in her car, the killer might have stolen her credit cards. Detective Beasley contacted her bank and learned that on the night of the murder, someone used her cash card 3 times at the same ATM.
You got $100 out the first time you used it, and that was all you could draw at that time from a cash point. So on one day is $100. He went back, tried to use it again, and then tried to use it a third time.
Detectives retrieved the ATM security camera photos, but they were too blurry to identify the man using the machine. Between the first and second transaction, another customer used the machine. The man told police that he remembered the encounter vividly. A young black man had just made a withdrawal when he arrived, but he didn't seem to be finished with his business.
He was standing next to him when he got the $100 out. Then he saw the guy try to use the card again. He said he was acting suspicious because he was wondering why it was taking him so long. He'd already seen him take the money out, so he knew he couldn't do it but one time, and here he is up there trying to use it again.
The witness gave a police sketch artist information regarding the suspect's height, weight, coloring, and facial features. Now armed with a detailed description, investigators went to the hospital. Someone recognized the face. It looked like a man who worked in the hospital laundry. The laundry room supervisor confirmed that the picture resembled 23-year-old Michael Sexton. His timesheet showed that he'd been on the job the day of Katie's murder, but disappeared that afternoon. She said he returned around 6:30.
He'd been missing for like 2 hours, And all of a sudden he comes running into the hospital, says he's got to go home, he's been having car trouble, and books. And he doesn't show up for work on Thursday and Friday.
To the detectives, Michael Sexton was acting like a man with something to hide. But they were still a long way from linking him to Katie's rape and murder. Detectives went to the home that Sexton shared with his girlfriend, who allowed them to search the residence. They collected some of his uniforms and pairs of tennis shoes, according to W.E. Hensley.
We collected 3 pairs of tennis shoes, and we took those all into our possession, and of course they were marked as potential evidence items, and we took those back to our lab to analyze for any possible matches.
The suspect's shoes and the muddy floor mats were sent to the Wake County Identification Bureau. There, Johnny Leonard specializes in footprint analysis.
There's one thing about criminals. They may put on gloves, they can put stockings over their faces, but hardly anybody thinks about their feet, because that's what you run with, that's what you walk on. So I always believe that footprints is the most overlooked evidence at crime scenes.
Leonard studied the muddy footprints, looking first for class characteristics like tread pattern. He then looked for individual characteristics like cuts or gouges. Next, he studied the 3 pairs of sneakers taken from the suspect's home.
Looking at the footprints, I could easily say that 2 of the sets of shoes did not make those tracks, because you can obviously look at them and see that the class characteristics were not the same.
But the 3rd pair was a similar size and make as the print from the crime scene. Leonard dusted the bottom of the shoe with magnetic powder. Then, with a wide piece of tape, he lifted the sole design and adhered it to a backing card. The card was placed in a large camera where it would be photographed and transferred to a transparency. Once it was developed, they could lay the transparency over the photograph of the mat for a comparison. But that would take time. They still needed to locate Sexton, who hadn't been seen in days. Detectives in North Carolina worked around the clock investigating the brutal murder of 24-year-old wife and mother, Katie Villoria. A man named Michael Sexton had been identified as a suspect, but had yet to be located. At the crime lab, latent print examiner Johnny Leonard had lifted latent shoe prints from the evidence taken from the crime scene. He placed a transparency of the suspect's sneaker print over a transfer of the floor mat from the victim's car. Leonard compared individual characteristics and finally found what he was looking for.
There was a little cut at the arch of one of the treadwear designs that was present also on the known shoes. So without a doubt, we knew that it was the same, made from the same shoe.
Investigators had evidence that tied the perpetrator to the vehicle, but still had nothing putting him in contact with the victim. While latent shoe prints are usually obtained from flat objects at a crime scene, even irregular surfaces can yield the occasional clue. Leonard applied magnetic powder to the upper sole and heel of the victim's shoe.
And lo and behold, a very small portion of a shoe track appeared.
He set the partial shoe print on a backing card and compared it to the full-size print of the suspect's sneaker. The partial print from Katie Villoria's shoe matched a portion of the suspect's shoe print.
Without a doubt, the suspect had been in contact with the victim personally.
Police went to the home that Sexton shared with his girlfriend, according to Detective Beasley.
The detectives located Michael Sexton at that point. We told him that we were talking to people at the hospital, and it was his turn would he come down and talk with us about it, which he agreed to do.
At the police department, Sexton was cooperative. He agreed to give biological samples for testing. Sexton swabbed the inside of his mouth to give a DNA sample. And he willingly allowed for hairs to be taken. These two would be compared in the lab. Criminalist Hensley recognized the importance of the evidence.
What we were dealing with and what we felt we were dealing with as far as evidence potential in this particular vehicle was blood, body fluids, hairs, fibers, clothing, and those are the things that we concentrated on.
Using a comparison microscope, examiners looked for similarities between two hair samples. Color, length, and diameter are among the major features analyzed. The known sample taken from the victim at autopsy and the unknown sample from the victim's van were compared side by side. The analysis confirmed the victim was not the source of the hair found in the van. But when the hair from the victim's van was compared to the sample taken from the suspect, it was practically a perfect match. That wasn't the only evidence placing Michael Sexton in the back of Katie Villoria's van. To fully process the clothing taken from Sexton's house, technicians laid the clothing out across a wide table. Using clear adhesive tape, they combed every inch of fabric for hair and fibers. Fibers from the victim's van were found on the suspect's clothing, and fibers from the clothing were found in the van. Investigators still needed to determine if the suspect's DNA matched the biological fluids found on the victim.
Certainly the body fluids that we found on the victim's body had the potential for DNA analysis. And they are more or less a positive form of identification. Other than fingerprints, if you can't find fingerprints, that certainly is one of the better forms of identification.
To analyze the suspect's DNA samples, scientists used a process called electrophoresis to separate specific enzymes out of each sample. Certain enzymes vary from person to person. Electrophoresis utilizes an electric current to separate the enzymes for analysis. The sample is placed in a gel and a current is applied, causing the enzymes to move through the gel. Each enzyme moves a certain distinct distance, creating a pattern of bands. If two blood samples create the same pattern, it's probable they came from the same source. In this case, they matched. At the police station, detectives confronted Sexton with the evidence. He denied everything.
As the interview went on, he kept digging a little bit deeper hole for himself and denying that he even knew her. And I think then he started looking for kind of an out, something that would make him look in the best light.
Sexton told police that he was having car trouble. He said that the victim offered to drive him to his cousin's to get some jumper cables.
And he said when he got around there that she consented to have sex with him, and then when they got in the back of the van, she changed her mind, and he knew she had seen his name tag and all that and was going to report him.
detectives knew there was more to the story. They believed that Sexton used his car trouble as bait. Fueled by a criminal appetite, he took advantage of Katie's kindness and overpowered her. The people of the state of North Carolina convicted Michael Sexton of first-degree murder and rape. He received the death sentence and was executed in November 2001. When a killer and a victim share no personal history, detectives can find themselves working in the dark. But for investigators committed to finding justice, no piece of evidence is too small. Today, forensic science can uncover a murder and bring to light evidence of a lethal encounter.